Marilyn Bryant stepped into the courthouse with a steady calm that most people might have mistaken for nervousness, but those who knew her well understood it was the calm before the storm, the kind of composure that came from years of experience in the courtroom, years spent watching others falter under pressure, years spent hiding the fact that she was the judge in the room, not just another defendant. She had dressed simply today, a modest blouse and slacks, because the focus needed to be on the case and not her, but still there was an undeniable air about her that commanded respect, even when no one knew her true title. She moved through the courtroom with quiet grace as people glanced at her for the first time and made judgments of their own. Judge Thomas Hall noticed her as soon as she entered, not because he saw something special in her, but because he had his own routine, and the case before him seemed like any other typical traffic violation. A woman from out of town who had probably made a careless mistake like the others before her, the ones he'd swiftly sent home with fines and warnings. Her paperwork was in order, and there was no hint of trouble, yet he made a mental note of her appearance, as one does with anyone they will never remember. And then he looked at the clock, ready to move on. Marilyn took her seat in front of the judge, silently watching as Hall flipped through her paperwork without even sparing her a glance. She could tell from his body language he had already decided how this would go. It was an unwritten rule in his courtrooms. Decisions were made before the defendant even spoke. Judge Hall had seen too many black faces walk through his doors for him to treat them as equals, and he certainly didn't have any reason to think this woman was different. She was just another name on a docket, another case to file away, another fine to collect. Hall looked up from the papers, finally meeting her eyes for the first time, and before Marilyn could speak, he interrupted her with a quick dismissal of her defense. She could feel the subtle sting of his words cutting through the air as he imposed the fine with the kind of finality that left no room for argument. But it was when he said the amount aloud that something shifted inside Marilyn. For a split second, his gaze lingered on her just long enough for her to register the subtle judgment behind his eyes, and for her to understand that she was being judged by more than her offense. She was being judged by her skin. The courtroom was silent for a moment before Hall moved on to the next case. As if nothing had happened, Marilyn stood there for just a moment longer, her mind racing, but her exterior unshaken. She accepted the fine without a word and turned to leave the room as the sound of her footsteps echoed in the silence. The eyes of the others in the room followed her retreating figure, some curious, some indifferent, but none of them knew the truth of who she was. None of them knew what she would do next. Marilyn left the courtroom with a purpose, but with no outward sign of the storm raging inside her. All they saw was a black woman walking away from a judgment that wasn't hers to take, and they would never know that she was the one who had the power to deliver the true judgment on him and on everything he represented. Marilyn walked out of the courthouse and into the harsh sunlight, her mind still lingering on the moment she left behind. The fine, the way Judge Hall dismissed her without a second thought, the way he judged her before hearing her voice. It wasn't new. She had been navigating this system for years, but something about today felt different. Maybe it was the casual arrogance with which he dismissed her, or maybe it was just the weight of having to silently endure yet another moment of disregard. Whatever it was, she didn't let it show on her face. Her steps were steady, measured, each one carrying her further from the courtroom, but her mind was already turning, calculating her next move. She didn't head to her car like most would after a day in court. Instead, she walked down the street to a small coffee shop tucked between two old buildings. The kind of place where you could sit alone for hours without anyone bothering you. It was quiet here, and that's just how she liked it. She ordered her coffee with precision, no unnecessary small talk, and sat by the window, watching the world go by. Marilyn had learned to carry herself in a way that didn't draw attention, not unless she wanted it. Years of working in the legal field, years of being underestimated, had taught her that staying below the radar was sometimes the smartest move. Today, however, it was more than just a need for silence. It was a reminder to herself that her worth wasn't defined by a traffic fine or the opinions of someone like Judge Hall. She was more than that. She had worked too hard to let the world forget that. Marilyn wasn't just a woman in a courtroom. She was a judge in her own right. Her experience stretched far beyond minor offenses and petty disputes. She had seen the ins and outs of the justice system, watched its flaws and biases play out day after day. She knew what it was to be treated as invisible, to have your voice drowned out by those who thought they were above you. But she also knew how to use the system to her advantage when necessary, and Judge Hall's careless mistake had just handed her a powerful opportunity. She wasn't sure how she would approach the situation yet, but she knew she had to act. A fine wasn't the issue. It was the principle. A judge, especially one like Hall, should have known better than to assume things based solely on appearance. There were laws in place that demanded respect for all individuals, regardless of their background. And she had no intention of letting him get away with treating her like just another case to dismiss. Not when she knew the weight of her own position in the system. Marilyn wasn't just any defendant in a courtroom. She was a force, a presence that could shake the foundations of that very court if she chose to. As she sipped her coffee, the adrenaline that had coursed through her earlier began to settle into a quiet resolve. She had dealt with far worse, and she would deal with this too. Judge Hall's disregard for her wasn't personal. It was part of a much larger pattern. A pattern she had seen far too often in her years on the bench. She had no illusions about what people like him thought of someone like her, but she also knew that change didn't come by accepting things as they were. Marilyn stood up, her coffee untouched, and left the shop with a single thought on her mind. It was time to make her move. Judge Hall had no idea what was coming. And when he found out, it wouldn't be a fine he was worried about. It would be his own judgment. A few days later, Marilyn found herself sitting in a conference room, a few floors above the bustling streets of the courthouse. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with legal texts and reports, but all of it faded into the background as she focused on the faces in the room. This wasn't just any gathering. It was a special judicial seminar, an event meant to gather the most seasoned judges in the area to discuss new reforms, evaluate ongoing cases, and share experiences. Marilyn had been invited not as a participant, but as a host, a judge who had spent years rising through the ranks in a different district, one that was less public but equally important. Judge Thomas Hall, who hadn't yet noticed her arrival, was sitting in the front row, casually scanning through his notes, preparing for the day's discussions. As Marilyn entered, the room fell silent for a split second. She had made sure to keep a low profile until now, blending into the crowd as much as possible. After all, she had no reason to make a spectacle of herself. But today was different. Today, the world was about to see her not as a defendant, but as a force of authority. Marilyn's eyes swept over the room, and her gaze naturally landed on Hall. He was still unaware that the woman who had been fined a few days ago, treated with such casual disregard, was the very judge running this seminar. Marilyn moved with purpose toward the podium at the front of the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The murmur of conversation stopped as she reached the microphone, and the room became deathly quiet. She could feel the eyes of the other judges on her, but it wasn't the audience she was concerned with. It was Hall. He looked up from his papers just in time to see her, and his expression shifted from neutral to one of confusion, and then disbelief. His eyes widened as he recognized her, the same woman he had fined just days before. Marilyn took a deep breath and introduced herself in a calm, measured tone. Her voice carried the weight of years of experience, yet there was an undeniable edge to it, one that spoke of quiet strength and authority. As she spoke, Hall's mind raced. He couldn't process the sheer irony of the situation. The woman he had treated so callously, the woman he had dismissed as just another defendant, was now standing before him as his peer, a fellow judge, and the one in charge of this entire seminar. It didn't take long for Marilyn to continue with the seminar, effortlessly commanding the room. But Hall could hardly focus on anything but the realization that he had just unknowingly imposed a fine on a judge, someone who had the power to hold him accountable in ways he couldn't imagine. As she discussed legal reforms, case evaluations, and the importance of fairness in the courtroom, Hall couldn't shake the knot in his stomach. He tried to focus, to pay attention to the content, but every time his eyes flicked toward her, he was reminded of the sheer gall he had shown when dealing with her case. How had he not known? How had he not recognized her name, her credentials? He had made countless assumptions based on her appearance, dismissing her as just another defendant to be processed. He had failed to see the humanity in her. He had failed to see the judge standing right in front of him. The weight of that realization hit him hard, and suddenly, the words coming from her mouth seemed to have an even sharper edge to them. She was speaking about fairness, about equal treatment, but her eyes, those sharp, observant eyes, told him everything he needed to know. This was no coincidence. Marilyn was not here by accident. She had been watching him, silently observing his every move. He had been the one to make a mistake, and she was now in control. The seminar ended with a round of applause, but Judge Hall could hardly focus on the accolades given to Marilyn. His mind was still reeling from the moment he realized who she was. He had treated her like just another defendant, a nameless face in a sea of cases, and now she stood in front of him, commanding the room, her presence undeniable, her authority unchallenged. The other judges filtered out of the room, exchanging pleasantries, discussing the day's talks, but Hall stayed seated, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to gather his thoughts. He needed to speak with Marilyn. He had to apologize, to make amends for his mistake, but the thought of approaching her made his stomach churn. How could he face her after everything that had happened? How could he confront the reality of his own ignorance? As the room emptied, Marilyn slowly gathered her notes and packed them into her bag. She had already sensed Hall's discomfort, his internal battle, even before the seminar had ended. She could see it in the way his gaze followed her, the way his shoulders tensed whenever she spoke. She knew that he had realized his error, but that wasn't enough. It wasn't just about him feeling guilty. It was about holding him accountable for his actions and the system he represented. Marilyn walked to the back of the room, her steps deliberate, and paused by the door, waiting. After a moment, Hall finally stood up, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and hesitation. He walked toward her slowly, as if every step was weighted with the knowledge of his own wrongdoing. When he reached her, he cleared his throat, the words getting caught in his throat for a moment. "Judge Bryant," he began, his voice sounding uncertain, almost apologetic. I didn't realize who you were. I made a mistake in your case, and I want to offer my sincerest apologies." Marilyn looked at him for a moment, her gaze steady, unblinking. She said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch between them. She wasn't going to make this easy for him. His apology, though a start, was insufficient. It wasn't just about the fine. It was about the years of biased judgments, the way he had viewed her and others like her as less than. He had made his apology, but she needed to hear more than just words. She needed action. "Judge Hall," she said finally, her voice cool but not unkind. "Apologies are a start, but they don't change what happened. You made a decision about me without knowing anything about who I am. You assumed, like many others do, that because I'm a black woman, I must be just another defendant, another case to dismiss. But I'm not, and neither is anyone else who steps into your courtroom." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the air between them. Hall shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't interrupt. He could feel the truth in her words, and it stung more than he wanted to admit. "I want you to understand something," Marilyn continued, her voice unwavering. "I'd spent my entire career fighting for fairness in a system that doesn't always work the way it should. I've been underestimated, overlooked, and treated as if I don't belong. But I've earned my place, just as you have. I don't want just an apology, Judge Hall. I want to make sure you understand how deep this problem runs. I want you to recognize the role you play in perpetuating it." For a moment, Hall said nothing. His mind was spinning, torn between the defensiveness that instinctively rose in him and the realization that she was right. She wasn't just talking about a single mistake. She was talking about something much larger, something that he had been blind to for years. The systemic issues in the courtroom, the biases that seeped into every decision, every ruling. He had been part of that system, perpetuating it without ever questioning it. Finally, he nodded, his voice quieter than before. "You're right. I've been blind to it, and I don't know how to make it right. But I want to learn. I want to understand what I've missed." Marilyn studied him for a moment longer before responding. "Then we'll start there. I'll help you, if you're willing to listen. But it's going to take more than just an apology. It's going to take action." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Hall standing there with the weight of her words heavy on his shoulders. He knew this was only the beginning. The real work would come later, and he had a long road ahead of him. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe, just maybe, he could be part of the change Marilyn spoke of, if he was willing to confront his own biases and truly listen. In the days that followed, Judge Thomas Hall found himself unable to shake the conversation he'd had with Marilyn. It haunted him, even in the quiet moments when he wasn't actively thinking about it. The weight of her words lingered in his mind, gnawing at him with an intensity he hadn't expected. His pride, his years of believing he was fair and impartial, began to crack under the pressure of self-reflection. He had assumed that because he followed the rules, he was above reproach, that his judgments were always based on the facts. But Marilyn had exposed the truth. He was blind to the biases that shaped his decisions. Judge Hall spent the following days in a kind of internal turmoil. He pored over old cases, combing through his past decisions, looking for patterns, for moments when his judgments may have been clouded by bias. He didn't find it immediately, but there were instances, small instances, that began to stand out. Cases where he had dismissed defendants too quickly, where he had handed down harsher sentences based on assumptions about a person's background or appearance. He had always prided himself on being a man of the law, believing that every decision was based on the law alone. But now he was questioning everything. His belief in his own objectivity felt fragile. He started to see the cracks, the ways in which his own upbringing, his own worldview, had colored his perspective. Late one night, after a particularly troubling day spent reviewing case files, Hall decided he needed to do more than just self-reflect. He needed to educate himself. So he began reading more. Books on race and justice, studies on unconscious bias, the works of civil rights activists, and scholars who had spent their lives challenging the very system he had served for so long. The more he read, the more he realized how much he had been unaware of, how much he had taken for granted in his own privilege. Despite his efforts, though, the guilt wouldn't go away. Hall could no longer view his job the same way. He began to question how many defendants had come through his court and been unfairly treated, simply because of the color of their skin, or their social status, or the preconceived notions he had about them. He couldn't fix it all at once. He couldn't undo the damage that had been done. But he could do something. He could start with himself, with his own actions, and make sure that no one else ever felt like Marilyn had. Marilyn had seen something in him that he hadn't seen in himself, the potential for change. She hadn't demanded he be perfect. She had simply asked him to see his biases, to recognize the ways in which the system worked against people like her. And now, Hall was starting to understand what she meant. But that understanding had come with a heavy price. The realization that he had played a part in a system that oppressed people like Marilyn. It was a difficult pill to swallow, but Hall knew that his only choice was to confront it head-on. He needed to make a change, not just in how he viewed others, but in how he conducted himself as a judge. It wasn't enough to simply apologize. It wasn't enough to acknowledge his mistakes. He needed to take responsibility for them and work toward true change. And so, he reached out to Marilyn, though he wasn't sure what exactly he hoped to say. He had no script, no rehearsed words, but he knew he needed to speak with her again. She had forced him to face the uncomfortable truth, and now it was time to take the next step, whatever that might be. Judge Hall's message was simple. "Can we meet again? I think I'm ready to listen." It was the beginning of a new journey for both of them. He had begun to confront the systemic issues within himself and the legal system. Marilyn's impact on him had been profound, but it was only the start of a long road. He didn't know where it would lead, but one thing was certain. He was no longer the same man who had dismissed her in that courtroom. The morning of their meeting, Marilyn arrived early. She wasn't sure what to expect from Judge Hall, but she knew it wouldn't be the same man who had dismissed her so cavalierly in the courtroom. The email he had sent was brief, but there was something in the simplicity of his words that told her he was serious about the change he was seeking. "Can we meet again? I think I'm ready to listen." Marilyn had considered ignoring him, letting him stew in his guilt, but she understood something about justice that many didn't. It wasn't just about the consequences, but about the potential for redemption. He had made a mistake, and maybe it was too late to undo the harm he'd caused. But if there was even a small chance he could evolve, then she owed it to the people he served to help him see that path. She found him sitting at a small table in a local cafe, alone, looking more like a man who had been up all night, rather than someone who had a reputation to maintain. His face was drawn, tired, and the eyes that met hers were different from the ones that had looked at her with such dismissiveness in the courtroom. The change in him was palpable, and she could sense the weight of his self-reflection in the air between them. "Judge Hall," she said, taking the seat across from him. Her voice was neutral, but there was a softness to it that spoke of understanding. "Thank you for reaching out." Hall nodded, not immediately speaking. It was clear he was gathering his thoughts, still unsure of where to start. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but earnest. "I spent the last few days. I guess I've spent my whole career looking at the law through a certain lens. I thought I was impartial. I thought that by following the rules, I was doing right by everyone in my courtroom. But after our conversation, I started questioning everything. And I realized how blind I've been." Marilyn studied him carefully, weighing his words. She wasn't here to give him a free pass, but she wasn't here to punish him either. She simply wanted to know if he was ready for the hard work ahead, the work that went beyond apologies. "Blindness is common," she replied. "We all carry biases, whether we recognize them or not. The difference between you and others who perpetuate that system is that you've taken the first step to confront yours. But awareness alone doesn't change anything, Judge Hall. You have to be willing to act differently." Hall nodded again, his gaze fixed on her. "I've been reading, trying to learn about race, bias, and the impact of my decisions. I've been looking back at my rulings, especially those where I dismissed people too quickly. It's hard to admit, but I see it now. I see where I've been part of the problem. But I need help understanding what comes next. What do I do now?" Marilyn leaned back in her chair, considering his question. She appreciated his honesty. But the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. The first step is to admit you're wrong, and you've done that. But then, you need to hold yourself accountable for your actions. Look at the cases in front of you with new eyes, not just with the law, but with empathy. Understand that the system isn't fair, that it's stacked against people who look like me. If you're going to be part of this system, you have to challenge it, not just follow it blindly. Her words weren't harsh, but they were firm. There was no room for complacency now. Hall wasn't just a judge in her eyes. He was someone who had the power to change things within the system, but only if he was willing to fight against it. "I understand," he said softly. "I want to change. I want to make sure that my courtroom isn't just a place where justice is blind, but where it's truly fair. I know it won't happen overnight, but I want to start. I want to earn back the trust of people like you, people who've been treated unfairly by this system for far too long." Marilyn sat quietly for a moment, weighing his sincerity. She could see it in his eyes now. The genuine desire to change. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wouldn't be a simple journey, but she could sense that the road ahead had already begun. He was willing to listen, to learn, and to act. That was a start. "I'm glad to hear that," she said finally. "But don't mistake this for forgiveness. Judge Hall, I'm not here to offer that. What I'm offering is the chance for you to do better. And when you're ready, we'll see what that looks like." With that, they both stood. Hall extended his hand, and for a moment, Marilyn hesitated. But then she took it, feeling the weight of the handshake as a symbol of something beginning. A change not just for him, but for the people who would walk into his courtroom tomorrow and the day after that. Weeks passed, and Judge Hall threw himself into the work of transformation. Marilyn's words had struck deep, and every day since their meeting, he had tried to live up to the accountability he had promised. He attended workshops on racial justice and bias in the legal system, reaching out to organizations he had never considered before. He read case studies of injustice and explored the impact of sentencing on marginalized communities. But the deeper he dug, the more overwhelming it felt. The cracks in the system were everywhere, and he had been part of it all along. But despite the discomfort, Hall was determined to make a difference. He began to change his approach to cases. He made a point of carefully reviewing the background of every defendant, seeking to understand their life circumstances before passing judgment. He consulted with experts in psychology, sociology, and criminal justice to gain insights into the root causes of crime. He asked for recommendations on diversion programs, especially for those who needed rehabilitation instead of punishment. For the first time in his career, Hall allowed himself to admit that the law alone couldn't deliver justice. The law was a tool, but it needed to be wielded with compassion, with an understanding of the human experience behind each case. One afternoon during a particularly difficult sentencing, Hall found himself staring at the defendant in front of him, a young man who had stolen a car in a desperate bid to escape his abusive home. Hall had seen the same patterns before: poverty, addiction, a broken family. But today, it was different. Hall saw this young man not as a criminal, but as someone caught in a cycle of trauma and neglect. His hands hovered over the gavel, his mind torn between what the law required and what he knew was right. In that moment, he remembered Marilyn's words. Justice isn't just about what the law says. It's about seeing the humanity in everyone who walks into your courtroom. And that was what he did. Instead of handing down a harsh sentence, Hall gave him a chance at rehabilitation, sentencing him to a program where he could receive therapy and support, giving him an opportunity to rebuild his life. When the decision was made, Hall felt a weight lift off his shoulders. This was the change he had been working for, but it was only the beginning. He had no illusions that his decisions would always be perfect, but he was learning. He was actively listening, questioning his own biases, and doing his best to ensure fairness in the courtroom. Meanwhile, Marilyn continued her work as well. She had been watching from the sidelines, not just as a colleague, but as a witness to Hall's growth. She had seen the first steps he had taken, the small but meaningful changes he was making in his practice. But she knew there was still work to do. She wasn't ready to offer forgiveness, nor was she interested in accolades. What mattered was whether Hall's transformation would have a lasting impact, not just on him, but on the broader system. One day, after a particularly long session, Hall called Marilyn, inviting her to join him for a quiet conversation. He had made a decision. "Judge Bryant, I need to thank you. Your words changed my perspective, and I've been trying to change the way I approach every case. I know it's not enough, but I'm committed to making real changes in the system," he said, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. Marilyn listened quietly, and after a long pause, she finally responded, "I've seen the change in you, Judge Hall. I'm not here to pat you on the back, though. I'm here because I want to know if you're ready to keep pushing forward. I want to know if you're ready to face the larger challenge ahead, reforming the system itself. It's not just your courtroom that needs to change. It's the entire justice system." Hall was silent for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. I've only started, but I want to do more. I'm ready." Marilyn's eyes softened. "Then let's work together. This isn't just about changing a few minds. It's about tearing down the structures that perpetuate injustice and building something better. We can't do it alone, but if we keep fighting, Maybe we can make a difference." As the conversation came to a close, Hall felt the weight of what lay ahead of him, but for the first time in his career, he felt a sense of hope. He had never imagined a path like this, but now, with Marilyn by his side, he wasn't afraid to walk it. The work would be long, and the obstacles would be many, but it had begun. Together, they could push for a future where fairness wasn't just a concept, but a reality. Months passed, and the partnership between Judge Hall and Marilyn Bryant deepened. What had begun as a conversation over coffee had blossomed into a shared mission. Together, they worked tirelessly to challenge the biases in the justice system, to push for reform, and to create a more equitable future for everyone who walked into a courtroom. Marilyn was often invited to speak at conferences and events, advocating for systemic change, and Hall began to accompany her. They spoke about the need for greater diversity in the judiciary, the importance of rehabilitation over incarceration, and the need for law enforcement and judges to recognize their own biases. Hall, once so firmly entrenched in the belief that the system was fair, now stood beside Marilyn, advocating for a complete overhaul of how justice was delivered. But despite their progress, there were still moments of resistance. There were colleagues who dismissed their efforts, who felt that Hall was being too lenient, too soft on crime. There were people who questioned whether reform was truly possible, people who believed that the system was beyond repair. It was exhausting, at times, to face so much opposition. Yet Hall and Marilyn pressed on, knowing that every step forward, no matter how small, was a victory. Then, one fateful day, a landmark case came before Hall's court. A young black woman, accused of shoplifting, stood before him, facing the possibility of years in prison. Her story was one of hardship, poverty, a troubled upbringing, and an abusive relationship. She had stolen food, not for greed, but to feed her child. Hall had seen similar cases before, but this one hit him harder. He saw Marilyn's face in this young woman's, the same pain, the same struggle. He glanced over at the prosecution, who seemed eager to press for the maximum sentence. He looked at the defense attorney, who seemed just as overwhelmed as the defendant. Then his gaze shifted back to the young woman, whose eyes were filled with fear and hopelessness. For a moment, Hall thought back to all the lessons he had learned from Marilyn. The importance of seeing the humanity in each person who stood before him, the need to recognize the broader societal forces at play. He couldn't help but remember how much he had changed since meeting her, how much more he understood now. Instead of handing down a sentence, Hall decided to do something different. He called for a recess and invited the young woman and her lawyer to meet with him privately. He wasn't sure exactly what would come out of it, but he knew he couldn't simply follow the old script of punishment. This wasn't about a violation of the law. It was about the circumstances that had led her to this point. When they reconvened, Hall spoke carefully, choosing his words with great care. "I understand that the law says I should punish you for this act, but the law does not take into account the life that brought you here," he said, looking directly at the young woman. "You are not a criminal. You are a mother. And today, I will not send you to prison. I will offer you the opportunity to attend a diversion program that will address your needs, give you the resources to care for your child, and help you get back on your feet. This is not a free pass, but it is a chance for you to make things right." The courtroom fell silent, the usual tension replaced by a sense of shock. The prosecution was visibly upset, but Hall held firm. This was his decision, and he knew it was the right one. He could see the relief in the woman's eyes as she broke into tears, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. After the case concluded, Hall turned to Marilyn, who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching him. She stood up and walked toward him, her expression unreadable. "You did it," she said simply, her voice quiet but proud. Hall nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "We did it, but we're not done. There's more work to be done, more lives to change." Marilyn smiled, her eyes meeting his with an unspoken understanding. "We've only just begun." In that moment, Hall understood that true justice wasn't just about following the law. It was about using the law to create a better world. And he was finally ready to fight for that world, no matter the resistance, no matter the difficulty. Together, he and Marilyn would continue to challenge the status quo, working toward a future where justice wasn't just a word in a textbook, but a living, breathing reality for everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background. And so, the journey continued, one step at a time.